On October 28, 1944, in a fog-choked forest along the French-German border, a 22-year-old staff sergeant made a decision that would be remembered by history and forgotten by the man who made it. In 10 minutes, armed with a borrowed weapon he barely knew how to use, Lucien.Adams walked alone into machine gun fire that had pinned down an entire company for hours. 9 Germans would fall. 2 would surrender. 200 Americans would live. This is not a story about heroism. This is a story about what happens when all the reasonable options disappear and only the unreasonable ones remain. This is what actually happened. The Mortana Forest did not announce itself with drama. It emerged from the rolling farmland of northeastern France like a dark smudge on the horizon, a dense wall of oak and beech that marked the contested ground between the Allied advance and the retreating Wehrmacht. By late October 1944, the euphoria of the liberation had curdled into something uglier. The breakout from Normandy had become a slog. Supply lines stretched thin. The weather turned, and the Germans, no longer racing eastward in disarray, had begun to dig in along every ridgeline and tree line they could fortify. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas had settled into a bitter arithmetic of yards gained and lives spent. For the men of Company K, 30th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, the forest was just another objective on a map that meant nothing until you were inside it. They had been moving through the hills northeast of Saint-Dye for 3 days, part of a larger push to dislodge German forces from the high ground overlooking the valley. Somewhere ahead of them, deeper in the woods, an entire American battalion had been cut off. The Germans had moved fast, infiltrating behind the advance units and establishing a network of positions that severed the supply route. For 72 hours, those men had been without resupply. No ammunition, no medical supplies, no food beyond what they carried. Radio contact was intermittent. Artillery support was impossible through the canopy. They were holding but barely, and every hour that passed made their position more precarious. Company K's mission was simple in concept and punishing in execution. Push through the forest, break the German blocking positions, and reopen the supply line. The terrain made everything harder. The Mortana was not the kind of forest you saw in picture books. There was no clear floor, no navigable paths. Undergrowth tangled around boots. Visibility dropped to 20 yards in places, sometimes less. The trees stood close enough that you couldn't see the sky, only fragments of gray light filtering through branches that dripped with condensation. The fog that morning made it worse. It rolled through the forest in thick banks, reducing the world to shapes and shadows. You heard things before you saw them. Sometimes you never saw them at all. Lucien.Adams moved through this landscape with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to conserve energy. At 22, he was young by civilian standards but not by infantry standards. He had been with the 3rd Division since North Africa. He had seen Sicily. He had been at Anzio, where the division spent 4 months in a meat grinder that turned the beachhead into a killing floor. He had landed in southern France during Operation Dragoon in August and pushed north through the Rhône Valley. By October, he had been in combat long enough to understand that survival was a statistical problem. You did your job. You kept your head down. You didn't volunteer for stupid things. And you hoped the dice didn't come up wrong on your turn. He was not an imposing figure. Thin, wiry, with a face that looked younger than his years. He spoke quietly when he spoke at all. His accent carried the flat vowels of Port Arthur, Texas, a refinery town on the Gulf Coast where men worked hard and said little. The Army had made him a staff sergeant not because he sought command but because he was competent and reliable and because attrition creates vacancies faster than ambition can fill them. The men in his squad trusted him. That was enough. The company had been moving since dawn, advancing in a loose tactical column with scouts forward and flankers out to either side. The pace was slow. Every few hundred yards, the lead elements would halt and the whole line would freeze while someone checked a sight line or investigated a noise. This was the rhythm of movement in hostile forest. You never knew if the next clearing held an enemy position or just more trees. You never knew if the silence meant safety or ambush. The only certainty was that rushing got people killed. By mid-morning, they had covered maybe 2 miles. The fog was lifting in patches, but the canopy kept everything dim and colorless. Adams could hear the labored breathing of the man ahead of him, the creak of equipment, the soft crunch of boots on wet leaves. No one spoke. Hand signals only. Somewhere far off, artillery rumbled, a low sustained thunder that might have been American or German or both. Closer. A machine gun chattered briefly and then stopped. That sound put everyone on edge. It meant contact somewhere, but the forest swallowed distance. You couldn't tell if it was 100 yards away or a mile. The order to halt came down the line in a series of raised fists. Adams dropped to one knee and scanned the trees ahead. Nothing. Just gray trunks receding into fog. He could see maybe 15 yards before everything dissolved into murk. The men around him spread out instinctively, putting space between targets. Minutes passed. Then the word came back. German positions ahead. Machine guns. The lead squad had walked into a kill zone and taken fire. One man down, maybe two. The company was pulling back to regroup. Adams felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not panic. Something colder. The recognition that the easy part of the day was over. They moved back 50 yards and formed a loose perimeter while the company commander and his officers huddled over a map that was already disintegrating from moisture. Adams couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the gestures. Pointing. Arguing. The problem was obvious even without the map. Somewhere ahead, the Germans had set up interlocking fields of fire. They had picked good ground, probably a slight rise or a clearing where they could cover the most likely approach routes. And they had MG-42s, the weapon every infantryman in Europe feared more than mortars or snipers or anything else the Wehrmacht fielded. The MG-42 was not just a machine gun. It was a psychological weapon. It fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that the individual shots blurred into a single tearing sound like fabric ripping at unimaginable speed. The Germans called it the Hitlersiege, Hitler's buzzsaw. The sound alone was enough to make men freeze. The effect was worse. A well-positioned MG-42 could deny an entire sector of ground. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't suppress it with rifle fire. You could try to flank it, but flanking meant exposing yourself to other positions, and the Germans rarely placed their guns in isolation. This was doctrine for them, refined over years of defensive warfare on the Eastern Front. Interlocking fire. Mutual support.
Killing zone.
Company K was stuck. The battalion ahead of them was running out of time. The supply line had to be open today, not tomorrow. But charging into prepared machine gun positions was suicide. Artillery couldn't help, not through the trees. Air support was grounded by weather. The only option was infantry work. Slow, deliberate, and deadly. Find the positions. Fix them. Flank them. Destroy them. Do it again for the next position. And the next. Hour after hour until you broke through or ran out of men. Adams listened to the officers' debate tactics. He didn't envy them. Every option was bad. Frontal assault would get people killed fast. Flanking maneuvers took time they didn't have. Waiting for reinforcements meant abandoning the trapped battalion. Someone suggested smoke grenades, but smoke in the forest just drifted and pooled and gave away your position. Someone else suggested a withdrawal to call in artillery once they were clear of the canopy, but that meant giving up ground and starting over. The conversation went in circles. And then someone mentioned the bar. The Browning automatic rifle was not technically a machine gun, though it filled that role in American infantry squads. It was a support weapon, heavier than a standard rifle, capable of selective fire. 20 rounds in a magazine. Effective range maybe 300 yards. It was designed to give a squad mobile firepower, something that could suppress an enemy position long enough for riflemen to maneuver. In theory, it was versatile. In practice, it was finicky. It overheated quickly. It jammed if you fired too many rounds too fast. The magazines were heavy and awkward, and you never had enough of them. Most bar men loved and hated the weapon in equal measure. Company K had one bar man, and he was down. Not dead, but hit badly enough that he couldn't fight. His weapon lay beside him, useless unless someone else could fire it. The problem was that the bar required familiarity. You had to understand its quirks, its rhythm, how to fire controlled bursts without cooking the barrel or wasting ammunition. You couldn't just hand it to anyone and expect results. Adams saw where the conversation was going before anyone said his name. He had fired a bar during training years ago, but he wasn't a barman. He carried an M1 Garand like most of the other riflemen. He knew the basics, but basics weren't the same as proficiency. Still, he was a staff sergeant. He was competent. And more importantly, he was expendable in the cold calculus that governed these decisions. Not expendable in the sense that his life didn't matter, but expendable in the sense that the officers couldn't afford to risk themselves and the company couldn't afford to lose too many men on a desperate gambit. The company commander looked at him. Adams looked back. No words passed between them, but the question was clear. Adams nodded. He didn't think about it. Thinking would have made it harder. He stood up, walked over to where the wounded barman lay, and picked up the weapon. It was heavier than he remembered. The magazine was still loaded. He checked the chamber, worked the action, felt the weight balance in his hands. Muscle memory came back in fragments. Safety off. Selector switch. Sight picture. He slung his Garand and hung the bar across his chest. Someone handed him 4 extra magazines. 80 rounds total. Not much. The plan, such as it was, emerged in a few terse sentences. Adams would move forward alone, using the fog and the trees as cover. He would try to locate the first machine gun position, get close enough to use a grenade, then move on to the next one. If he could knock out even one MG-42, it might create an opening for the rest of the company to advance. If he got killed in the process, well, that was one casualty versus the dozens they'd take in a frontal assault. No one said it that bluntly, but everyone understood. Adams checked his grenades. He had 4. 2 fragmentation, 2 smoke. The frags were standard Mark II pineapples, cast iron with a 4-second fuse. You pulled the pin, let the spoon fly, counted 1, 2, then threw. If you held it too long, you blew yourself up. If you threw it too soon, the enemy had time to dive for cover or throw it back. Timing was everything. The smoke grenades were less predictable. They might obscure movement or they might just announce your position. He decided he'd use them only if he had no other option. No one wished him luck. That would have been too much like a farewell. Instead, the men around him just watched as he moved toward the tree line, and then they looked away because watching made it harder. Adams felt the weight of their attention lift as he slipped into the fog. The noise of the company receded behind him. His breathing became the loudest sound in his world. The forest closed around him like a fist. Visibility dropped to 10 yards, then 5. He moved slowly, placing each foot with care, avoiding branches that might snap underfoot. His senses sharpened. Every shadow became a potential threat. Every sound demanded interpretation. The fog played tricks with distance. He heard voices once, German voices, low and clipped, but he couldn't tell if they were 20 yards away or 50. He froze, waited, let the sound fade before moving again. He was operating on instinct now, on years of accumulated knowledge that lived in his body rather than his mind. Watch the ground. Watch the trees. Watch the spaces between. Don't look at any one thing too long. Keep moving, but never in a straight line. Trust your peripheral vision. When you stop, stop behind cover. Never silhouette yourself. These were not conscious thoughts. They were reflexes. The first MG-42 announced itself with sound before he ever saw it. That unmistakable ripping noise, a burst of maybe 30 rounds, firing at something off to Adams' left. He dropped flat and pressed himself into the wet leaves. The gun fired again, a longer burst this time, and Adams used the sound to triangulate. Ahead and slightly right, maybe 40 yards. The fog made it hard to judge. He waited for the next burst, then started moving again, angling toward the sound. He found the position by accident. The fog lifted for just a moment, a gap in the gray, and there it was. A shallow depression in the ground, reinforced with logs and branches, the barrel of the MG-42 protruding through a narrow firing slit. He could see 2 men, maybe 3. One on the gun, one feeding the belt, one watching the flanks. They were focused forward, scanning for movement in the direction Company K had retreated. They hadn't seen him. Adams' heart hammered in his chest. His mouth was dry. He was maybe 25 yards from the position, close enough to see details. The coal scuttle helmets, the Feldgrau uniforms blending into the forest floor, the spare ammunition boxes stacked beside the gun. Close enough to hear them talking, low, urgent words he couldn't understand. He had one chance. If he missed with the grenade, they'd turn the gun on him and he'd be dead before he hit the ground. If he threw short, the logs would absorb the blast. If he threw long, they'd have time to scatter. He pulled the pin on the first fragmentation grenade, felt the spoon release, and counted 1-2 in his head while his hand drew back. The throw had to be perfect. He stood, exposed for just a fraction of a second, and released. The grenade arced through the fog in a lazy parabola and disappeared into the position. The explosion was sharp and flat, muffled by the earth and the logs but still loud enough to make his ears ring. He heard screaming. Not the screaming of someone hit badly, but the short, sharp yells of shock and pain. He didn't wait to see the damage. He was already moving, angling left, away from the position, because anyone still alive would be firing at his last known location. The MG-42 stayed silent. He had killed men with that grenade. Maybe all three, maybe just one or two. He didn't know and couldn't afford to think about it. There were 2 more guns somewhere ahead, and every second he wasted gave them time to react. He pushed forward, deeper into the fog, and the forest swallowed him again. The second position was harder to find. He moved for 5 minutes, maybe 10, and heard nothing. The fog was thickening again, reducing the world to a gray nullity. He started to wonder if he'd lost his bearings, if he was moving parallel to the German line instead of through it. Then he heard it. The metallic clink of metal on metal, the sound of someone changing an ammunition belt. He froze and listened. The sound came again, unmistakable, and this time he could place it. Ahead and right. Close. Very close. He moved toward the sound with agonizing slowness. The fog was both blessing and curse now. It hid him, but it also hid them, and if he stumbled into the position at point-blank range, there would be no time to react. He saw the logs first, a low wall of timber barely visible through the murk. Then he saw movement. A helmet. A shoulder. The silhouette of the MG-42's barrel sweeping slowly left to right. This position was better fortified than the first. The gun sat in a proper dugout with overhead cover, the kind of position that would shrug off anything less than a direct hit. Adams crouched behind a tree and considered his options. He was maybe 15 yards away, close enough to throw a grenade but not close enough to guarantee accuracy. If he missed, they'd know he was there. If he hesitated, someone might spot him. He reached for his second fragmentation grenade. The motion saved his life. As his hand closed around the grenade, the MG-42 opened fire. A long tearing burst that shredded the tree trunk above his head and filled the air with splinters and bark. He threw himself sideways, rolled behind thicker cover, and came up with the grenade already in his hand. Someone was shouting in German, urgent orders, and he heard boots moving, the sound of men repositioning. They'd seen something, a flicker of movement or a shadow, and now they were hunting him. He pulled the pin and threw without thinking, a flat, hard throw that sent the grenade tumbling into the dugout. He didn't watch it land. He was already diving for new cover when the explosion came, a savage crack that lifted dirt and smoke into the air. The machine gun stopped. The shouting stopped. For a moment, there was only silence and the ringing in his ears. He waited 10 seconds, 20, listening for movement. Nothing. He rose to a crouch and approached the position with the bar raised and ready. The dugout was a ruin. The logs had been blown apart. The gun lay on its side, the barrel bent at an unnatural angle. There were bodies, but Adams didn't look at them directly. Peripheral vision only. Enough to confirm they weren't moving. Enough to know he didn't need to fire. He turned away and kept moving. 2 down. 1 to go. His hands were shaking now. Not from fear but from adrenaline, the chemical flood that made everything sharp and bright and too fast. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to reset, to focus. The third gun was out there somewhere. It would be the hardest to find because by now the Germans knew something was happening. They would be alert. They might have shifted position. They might be waiting for him. He moved in a wide arc, trying to flank where he thought the third position might be. The fog was starting to lift, which made everything more dangerous. He could see farther now, maybe 30 yards, but so could they. He heard movement off to his left and dropped flat again. Voices. German. Multiple voices. Not relaxed conversation but tense, clipped exchanges. He couldn't see them, but he could track them by sound. They were moving, searching, trying to figure out what had happened to the other two guns. Adams realized with cold clarity that he was now behind their line. He had pushed through the initial positions and was in the gap between the German strongpoints and whatever reserves they had further back. This was both opportunity and trap. If he could find the third gun from behind, he'd have the advantage of surprise. But if he stumbled into their reserves, he'd be surrounded. He saw the third position through sheer luck. The fog parted again, and there it was. Another dugout, this one dug into the side of a slight rise, with a better field of fire than the previous two. The MG-42 was manned, the crew alert and scanning the forest ahead of them. They didn't know he was behind them. Not yet. Adams had one grenade left. One fragmentation grenade against a fortified position with at least 3 men, possibly more. He was 40 yards away, too far for an accurate throw. He needed to get closer, but every yard he advanced increased the chance they'd spot him. He looked at the bar in his hands. 80 rounds. Maybe less. He'd never fired the weapon in combat. He didn't know if it would jam, if he could control the recoil, if he could hit anything at this range. He made the decision without conscious thought. Close enough to throw meant close enough to die. The bar gave him distance. He dropped to a prone position, nestled the weapon into his shoulder, and flipped the selector to automatic. The sight picture was terrible. The rear sight was too small, the front post too thick. He aimed for the center mass of the position, for the dark opening where the barrel protruded, and squeezed the trigger. The bar roared. 20 rounds gone in 2 seconds. A long sustained burst that made the weapon buck against his shoulder. He saw dirt kick up around the dugout, saw splinters fly from the logs, saw one of the German soldiers jerk backward. The gun was louder than he expected, the recoil harder to manage. He released the trigger, ejected the spent magazine, and slammed in a fresh one while the Germans scrambled for cover. The MG-42 swung toward him. He saw the barrel tracking, saw the gunner hunched behind the sights, and fired again before they could. Another burst, shorter this time, controlled. The bar hammered in his hands. He walked the fire across the position, stitching the logs, the sandbags, the narrow opening. Someone screamed. The MG-42 fired a wild burst that went high and wide, and then it stopped. Adams changed magazines again. His third. 40 rounds left. He waited, watching the position, looking for movement. The fog drifted across his field of view, obscuring and revealing in equal measure. He saw a helmet move, just a flicker, and fired a short burst. The helmet disappeared. Silence returned. He rose to a crouch and advanced, weapon up, finger on the trigger. Every step felt like walking on ice. His nerves screamed at him to stay down, to wait, to let someone else take the risk. But there was no one else. Just him and the gun in his hands and the position ahead that might already be destroyed or might be waiting to kill him. He reached the dugout and looked inside. 3 men. 1 dead, 1 dying, 1 conscious but wounded badly enough that he couldn't fight. The wounded man looked at Adams with wide, terrified eyes and raised his hands. Adams stared at him. The moment stretched. Then he gestured with the barrel. "Get up." The German crawled out of the dugout, slow and shaking. Adams saw another movement and spun, but it was just the second wounded man trying to sit up. He gestured again. "You two." 2 prisoners. He hadn't planned for prisoners. He didn't know what to do with them. He couldn't take them back himself, not alone, and he couldn't leave them armed. He made them empty their pockets, remove their belts, take off their boots. Then he pointed back toward the American lines and told them in broken gestures to start walking. They stumbled off into the fog, limping and dazed, and Adams let them go because keeping them was more trouble than it was worth. He turned back to the German line. Ahead, the forest was quiet. The machine guns were silent. All 3 positions destroyed in maybe 15 minutes. He felt nothing. No triumph, no relief. Just a dull, empty exhaustion that made his limbs feel heavy. He checked the bar. 1 magazine left. 20 rounds. He started walking back toward Company K. He found them where he'd left them, still in their perimeter, still waiting. When he walked out of the fog, several men raised their weapons before recognizing him. No one spoke at first. They just stared. Then someone asked if he was hit. Adams shook his head. Someone else asked about the guns. Adams said they were gone. The company commander came forward, looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and started issuing orders. The company would advance. They'd push through to the trapped battalion. The supply line would reopen. Adams handed the bar to someone and retrieved his garand. His hands were still shaking. He sat down with his back against a tree and closed his eyes while the company prepared to move. Someone gave him water. He drank it without tasting it. When the order came to advance, he stood up and fell in with his squad, just another soldier in the line. The rest of the day was anticlimactic. Company K moved through the forest without further resistance. They found the trapped battalion before nightfall, delivered supplies, and established a secure perimeter. The mission was successful. The supply line was open. 200 men who might have died or surrendered would live to fight another day. In the grand sweep of the war, it was a minor action, a footnote, one small tactical victory among thousands. But for those 200 men, it was everything. Adams didn't talk about what he'd done. When people asked, he gave short answers. It was the bar, mostly. The grenades worked. The Germans didn't see him until it was too late. He made it sound routine, technical, like describing how to change a tire. The men in his company knew better. They'd seen the positions afterward. They'd counted the bodies. They'd heard the estimates. 9 Germans dead or wounded, 2 captured, 3 machine guns destroyed. 1 man, 1 weapon, 10 minutes. The story spread. Not from Adams but from others. It reached battalion headquarters, then regimental, then division. Someone wrote a report. Someone else wrote a recommendation. The machinery of military bureaucracy ground forward, transforming action into paperwork, paperwork into recognition. Adams wanted no part of it. When his company commander told him he was being put in for a medal, Adams shrugged and said, "Whatever you think is best." He didn't believe medals meant anything. They were symbols, abstractions, ways for officers to organize chaos into narrative. The men who earned them were usually dead. The men who survived rarely cared. Months passed. The war ground on. The 3rd Division pushed into Germany, crossed the Rhine, advanced into Bavaria. Adams stayed with his unit, doing his job, keeping his head down. He was wounded twice, minor injuries that kept him out of action for a few days each time, but nothing that sent him home. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, he was a platoon sergeant. He'd been in combat for nearly 2 years straight. He was 23 years old. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place in Nuremberg in late 1945, months after the shooting had stopped. The city was a ruin, a landscape of rubble and burned-out buildings. The ceremony was held in a requisitioned building that had somehow survived the bombing. Generals attended, photographers, journalists. Adams stood at attention while someone read the citation aloud, a formal recitation of what he'd done in the Mortana Forest. The words made it sound clean and noble. They didn't mention the shaking hands or the empty feeling afterward. They didn't mention the faces of the German soldiers in that last dugout or the fact that Adams sometimes saw those faces when he tried to sleep. When the medal was pinned to his uniform, Adams saluted and shook hands with the officers. He said thank you when it seemed appropriate. He posed for photographs. He answered questions from reporters with the same terse economy he'd used to describe the action to his squadmates. "Yes, sir." "No, sir. I was just doing my job." The reporters seemed disappointed. They wanted heroism, inspiration, something quotable. Adams gave them nothing. He didn't understand what they wanted from him. He'd walked into machine gun fire because someone had to and because the alternative was watching men die. That wasn't heroism. It was arithmetic. He went home to Port Arthur after the war. The town threw a parade. The local newspaper ran a story. People recognized him on the street and wanted to shake his hand. Adams hated it. He hated the attention, the expectation that he should be proud, the assumption that killing 9 men was something to celebrate. He started avoiding public places. He took a job at the refinery, third shift, where he could work alone. He married, had children, lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to the stories people told about him. The Medal of Honor sat in a drawer. Sometimes his children asked to see it. Adams would take it out, let them hold it, then put it away. He never wore it. He never displayed it. When veterans' organizations invited him to speak, he declined. When journalists called for interviews on anniversaries, he hung up. He wanted nothing to do with the mythology that had grown around those 10 minutes in the forest. They weren't sacred. They weren't transcendent. They were just 10 minutes when everything went right and he didn't die, and that didn't make him special. It made him lucky. In the decades that followed, historians and researchers tried to understand what Adams had done and why. The tactics became a case study in infantry schools. The use of the bar at close range. The grenade employment. The solo advance through hostile territory. It looked, from the outside, like a masterpiece of small unit action. It looked like courage distilled to its purest form. But Adams, in the rare moments when he discussed it at all, described it differently. He said it was a bad plan that happened to work. He said he was scared the entire time. He said he got lucky that the fog was thick and the Germans were looking the wrong way. He said if he'd known how dangerous it was, he probably wouldn't have done it, and that scared him more than the memory of the action itself. This is the tension that defines Adams' story. The disconnect between what the world saw and what the man lived. History remembers the 10 minutes. Adams remembered everything around it. The weight of the bar, the faces of the prisoners, the shaking that wouldn't stop, the sick feeling in his stomach when he realized how close he'd come to dying for no reason except that someone had to do something. History makes monuments. The men who earn them just want to forget. Adams died in 1983 at the age of 61. He left behind a wife, children, and a legacy he never wanted. The obituaries mentioned the Medal of Honor. They recounted the action in Mortana Forest. They called him a hero. His family held a quiet funeral. There was no military procession, no 21-gun salute, no delegation from the Pentagon. Adams had specified in his will that he wanted no military honors. He wanted to be buried as a civilian, as a husband and father, not as a soldier. His family respected that wish. The medal went to a museum eventually, donated by his children after his death. It sits now in a climate-controlled case alongside the citations of other recipients, a small piece of metal that represents something too large to quantify. Visitors walk past it every day. They read the placard. They see the name Lucien Adams and the date October 28, 1944, and the words conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action. They take photographs. They move on. None of them know what it felt like to hold that bar in shaking hands, to count 1-2 before throwing a grenade, to see the faces of men you just killed. None of them need to. This is how history works. It takes the unbearable weight of lived experience and compresses it into symbols we can carry. It turns chaos into narrative, terror into triumph. It gives us stories we can tell ourselves about courage and sacrifice because the truth, the real truth, is too messy and too random and too close to meaninglessness. Adams understood this. That's why he stayed silent. Not because he was modest or humble, but because he knew that the story people wanted wasn't the story that happened. What happened in Mortana Forest wasn't heroism. It was a 22-year-old man with no good options making a choice that could have killed him but didn't. It was luck and timing and a borrowed weapon he barely knew how to use. It was fog lifting at the right moment and Germans looking the wrong way and grenades landing where they needed to land. It was 10 minutes of controlled chaos followed by a lifetime of trying to reconcile what he'd done with who he wanted to be. The men he saved went on with their lives. They fought in other battles. Some died. Some went home. Most never knew his name. That was fine with Adams. He didn't do it for gratitude. He did it because Company K needed those machine guns destroyed and no one else could do it. The fact that he survived didn't make him special. It made him the one who had to carry the memory. In the end, that's the real story. Not the 10 minutes, but the 61 years that followed. Not the medal, but the man who put it in a drawer. Not the courage but the quiet refusal to let courage define him. Lucien.Adams was a soldier who did something extraordinary and spent the rest of his life insisting it wasn't. He was a hero who rejected heroism. He was a man who understood that the distance between living and dying in combat is so small, so arbitrary, that celebrating the living feels like an insult to the dead. History needs its heroes. Civilization requires mythology. We need stories about ordinary men doing extraordinary things because those stories remind us that courage is possible, that individuals matter, that some actions echo beyond their moment. But the men who live those stories often see them differently. They see the randomness. They see the friends who didn't make it. They see the choices that weren't choices at all, just the least bad option in a situation with no good ones. Adams lived with that knowledge for 38 years after the war ended. He went to work. He raised his family. He watched the world change. And occasionally, late at night, he remembered a gray morning in a French forest when he walked into machine gun fire and lived. Not because he was brave but because someone had to. Not because he wanted a medal but because 200 men needed a supply line. Not because he was a hero but because heroism, real heroism, is just doing what needs to be done when all the reasonable options have disappeared. That's what happened on October 28, 1944. That's what the medal in the museum represents. That's what Lucien.Adams spent a lifetime trying not to think about. And that's why his story matters. Not because it's inspiring, but because it's true. Because it shows us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move forward despite it. And sometimes, just sometimes, that decision changes everything. The forest is still there. The Mortana. You can walk through it today if you want. The dugouts are gone, reclaimed by time and vegetation. The trees have grown back where shells and grenades tore them down. There's nothing to mark the spot where Adams stood with a borrowed bar and changed the outcome of a day. History doesn't leave markers for every act of courage. Most of them happen in places no one remembers, witnessed by no one who survives, recorded by no one who cares. The fact that we know about Lucien.Adams at all is an accident of documentation, a quirk of bureaucracy that preserved one story while 10,000 others disappeared. But knowing the story doesn't mean understanding it. Understanding requires accepting that the man and the myth are different things. The myth is clean. The man was complicated. The myth is heroic. The man was scared and lucky and deeply uncomfortable with what he'd done. The myth is what we need. The man is what actually happened.